Hey guys, while my channel doesn't normally feature hobby-based content, I do consider myself to be fairly adept at the hobbying aspect of Warhammer 40k. This video will detail my experience with a few of the new contrast paints in the range, and will close with my overall opinions on them and how I believe they can be best used. Before we get started, let me fill you in on the scenario. My Slaanesh Demon's army originally had 3 Fiends of Slaanesh, which I painted using the existing method: base, layer, shade, and highlights. Looking at just the skin tones, I started with a white primer base, then a base coat of Screamer Pink, and an all-over wash of Carlberg Crimson mixed with Lamian Medium at a 1:1 ratio. Then I layered in various tones by mixing Screamer Pink, Pink Horror, and Kislev Flesh, which were all applied with at least a splash of Lamian Medium. As you can see, there were a gang of paints used, which resulted in the process taking the increased time you would expect. But overall, I'm very pleased with how the skin tones turned out. Shortly after the contrast paints were released, I ended up getting 3 more Fiends, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to get some experience with the new paint range. Based on the skin tone of my existing units, and using some handy contrast paint charts I found online, I decided to get the Wraithbone Primer and Volupus Pink, as I felt that combination would get me closest to the skin tone of my already painted Slaanesh demons. I also picked up the contrast medium to see what kind of results can be achieved. I wanted to determine 2 things for myself. Can these new paints actually use one thick coat to paint models? And will these larger, fancier contrast paints be an adequate replacement for the existing range? And here we are. While these Fiends are not completely finished, the skin tones are with regards to the contrast experiment. Let's go over the results. I decided I wanted the first Fiend to serve as my control in the experiment, so I grabbed a larger brush and began to slather Volupus Pink on, doing so in one thick coat. My mindset when doing so was, how would a beginner or someone who just wants to get color on their minis so they can put them on the table apply their paint? And here we can see the result. It's pretty ugly, but I should mention, these are larger models, where typically the one thick coat is, to my knowledge, mostly advertised on infantry units. I believe the larger surfaces are causing the contrast paint to struggle in achieving their marketed effect. Either way, the result is obviously far worse than my previously done Fiends. But, and I can't emphasize this enough, it also took far less time. Another interesting takeaway is that while the paint was applied thickly, it dried surprisingly thin. Had I applied a regular base paint in this heavy-handed way, this Fiend would be ready to become a pro-painted model on eBay. The next test I wanted to do was to really dilute the Volupus Pink with the contrast medium. Here I did approximately a 5:1 ratio. I find the result to be a fairly nice effect. A soft, less saturated pink that was distributed all over the model fairly evenly, but still maintained some darker tones in the recessed areas. Its application reminded me of some technical paints such as Hexwraith Flame or Nighthaunt Gloom. I would like to mention that Volupus Pink is one of the darker colors of the contrast range. If you are using a lighter pigment, I imagine you wouldn't need to use such a drastic ratio. On the last Fiend, I repeated what I did for Fiend number 2, and followed up with another layer, this time in a 2:1 ratio. Comparing it to one of the Fiends from my first batch, it's still a worse result, but not nearly as severe as the results of our Control Fiend that used one thick coat. Comparing it directly to the Control Fiend, we have a comparable depth in the color and tones, but with much smoother transitions in the contrast itself. Also worth noting is because of the translucent nature of the paints, they seem to blend fairly well, as you can see on the claws of the contrast Fiends, which have been done in Militarum Green. I find they behave very similar to glazes with regards to their ease in creating blends. So on the topic of one thick coat, I believe that claim remains to be true, although I found I could get far superior results by building up multiple thin coats. At least for bigger models, which have larger surface areas, it seems to make a substantial difference. With that said, I think the one thick coat catchphrase is actually fairly valid. I believe using contrast paints in this way will be quite beneficial for people who just want to get playing. Putting this model down on the table and seeing it at length actually looks surprisingly adequate. And as a bonus, should you want to revisit and improve the paint job, the contrast paint has dried so thin that you can probably continue working the model at a later date. And to answer the question of, is this paint line meant to replace the existing range? Not at all, at least not for me. I think for hobby adepts like myself, really it's just another tool for us to use to get the job done. I feel a lot of the controversy around the new range is actually due to the marketing. I mean, even the name itself is very trendy and indicative of that intention. In my mind, the contrast range can be considered technical glazes, which offer a rich range of colors and have a wide variety of application with regards to their use. Well, that's it for my experience with the contrast paints. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this type of hobby-centric content and want to see more of it, or have any follow-up questions, feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.